All right, hello everybody. Looks like we've got a few more folks in the waiting room here. We're gonna let them in. All right, and then we will get started with our first Friday event for this month. My name is Carol Easterly. I am one of the museum program coordinators. Just to make sure, because I never know, can you guys hear me? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, perfect. I know we had some issues last month. My name is Carol Easterly. I'm one of the museum program coordinators here at the Kentucky Historical Society. Welcome to our monthly First Friday speaker series. Very happy to have one of our own colleagues sharing with us this month. Just before we get started, a few reminders. First of all, just make sure to keep your microphone muted throughout the program so we don't have any background noise distractions. If you'd like to put your camera on, please feel free to do so. It's nice to see you smiling back at us. We just want to make sure that we keep all conversation friendly and respectful throughout the program. And to let you know about a few events happening here at KHS. Right now, our Kentucky Ancestors Genealogical Discovery Program is airing. We're down to our last couple of episodes, but you can look at our website, history.ky.gov, to find out more about which local channels are carrying those. The episodes are also going to be available on the KHS YouTube channel. So it's lots of fun, hosted by Heather French Henry. So please do check that out. We are almost through week 3 of summer camp here at the History Center. So, and I'm not even teaching, and it like wears me out. So I know Rebecca has been working very hard, but we still have 3 more weeks. We're taking a week off for the 4th, but there are 3 more weeks of camp after that. I believe there are probably still some openings for some of those weeks. So if you have kiddos or know of some kiddos who need to get out of the house, need something to do the last few weeks of summer, definitely check out our website, give us a call. And hopefully they can come hang out with us for camp. Also coming up some more this summer, we had our first Tipsy Town Tales pub crawl and history tour this past month. Had a great time, if I do say so. It's my program. And so we have a couple more scheduled for the summer. We're going to be adding some dates for the fall. I was sitting here looking at the slides, scrolling, and realized that I have the wrong date on the slide for my very own program. So nobody to blame but myself. Our next date is July 16th. It's from 7 to 8:30 p.m. You can register at history.ky.gov. Come hang out with us. It's a good time. Or you can come see us in August or September. And of course, we also want you to know about next month's First Friday program. Friday, August 5th, our speaker will be Dr. William H. Turner. He is the author of The Harlan Renaissance, Stories of Black Life in Appalachian Coal Towns. I'm pretty excited about that one. But I do want to introduce you to our speaker today, one of our KHS colleagues, which always makes me very happy. I feel very fortunate to work with some really smart, cool people, and I love getting to show off their work. And so our speaker today is Dr. Daniel Burge. He is a native of Washington, D.C., graduated from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and then did his Ph.D. at the University of Alabama, where he was also an instructor in their history department. And KHS snagged him from Bama. He and his wife, Luann, actually moved up here during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, bless them. We were all still pretty much working from home. I think it was actually a couple months before I got to meet you in person. So here at KHS, Daniel is the associate editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. That's our scholarly publication. And he and Stephanie are doing some great work. But Daniel also manages our research fellowship program here at KHS, and that's actually been keeping him very, very busy the last few months. A lot of scholars that had to postpone research during COVID restrictions are now doing those trips. And so we've had lots and lots of researchers joining us here at KHS the last few months, and that's going to continue through the summer. That's been fun. And Daniel's doing a great job taking care of them. In addition, he's been very, very busy publishing his own research. When I took a look at his CV, I was like, what have I been doing with my life? Because he's published all kinds of stuff. Scholarly articles, book chapters, but most recently, and most exciting, is his brand new book, A Failed Vision of Empire, The Collapse of Manifest Destiny, 1845 to 1872, which he is going to share with us today. Daniel, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. Please take it away.
Thank you for having me. Let me share my screen here. There we go. Can everyone see it? Is it good? Reset. When I first started thinking about what to do for this particular talk, one of the things that was sort of challenging was, how do I approach people's knowledge of manifest destiny? It's a topic a lot of people have heard about. It's a topic a lot of people sort of have some familiarity with, but I wanted to sort of back this up, hit it from the beginning. I always crack up when I talk to people because they're always like, oh, that's such an interesting topic. But then when you start to talk to them, sometimes they don't really know much about manifest destiny. I think most of us have heard something about it. So I want to really quickly go back to the beginning. And this is where I will pick up the story. The phrase manifest destiny comes from this. So what we see in 1845 is the United States Magazine and Democratic Review. They will come out and they will put out this statement. And it's other nations have undertaken to intrude themselves for the avowed object of limiting our greatness and checking the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. So we do know as historians that this is the origins of the phrase manifest destiny. It comes out again in 1845. It is anonymous. So we do not know exactly who put forth or who wrote this particular phrase. As we move along, though, and as I'll sort of hit on as we go, one of the things we'll see is that most historians have taken sort of a similar view of manifest destiny and what it meant. So this is from a recent book, David Reynolds, who published Empire of Liberty. Manifest destiny was a slogan that captured the public imagination, signifying America's God-given right as instrument of liberty and progress to occupy all the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So you see that play out. If you pick up a lot of different books on manifest destiny, you'll come across this same idea, this idea that manifest destiny signifies east to west expansion. It's popular, it's relatively pervasive. Most people believe in it. I'll throw up another quote, which comes from a book titled Manifest Destiny. Quote, Polk's presidency fulfilled what newspaper writer John L. O'Sullivan described as the United States' manifest destiny to expand to the Pacific Ocean. So again, this idea of manifest destiny as east to west, as being very popular in the decade of the 1840s, as something that most people in the US, or at least the vast majority, believed in it. And that sort of ends at the end of the decade when the United States annexes a good portion of Mexico. So this is what I was working with when I started this project, sort of this basic understanding of manifest destiny. My original thought and what I originally hoped to do when I first approached this project was, okay, if this is how people see manifest destiny in the 1840s, what's sort of the flip side of that? So in other words, how do people approach manifest destiny who don't necessarily agree with it, who don't go along with this? Why are there people who basically don't agree with the idea of manifest destiny? But as I started to get into this topic, and here's another image that sort of shows the idea of manifest destiny from 1840s. I'll get to that in just a bit. But as I started to approach this, one of the things I came across was people talking about manifest destiny in ways that I was not familiar with. A quote from an 1861 newspaper, which says, quote, "This is the end of our manifest destiny, as preached by the Democratic Party for years. Manifest destiny is played out, and thank God for it." Again, from this particular quote, you can see they don't see manifest destiny as being successful. They clearly don't see it as being something that regards US expansion from east to west. I'll throw another quote out there. Quote, "Manifest destiny marks out the North American continent as the future map of the United States." And this is from the New York Herald. And if you check the year, it comes in the 1860s, late 1860s, so after the Civil War, which again is interesting because it's not talking about manifest destiny as something that is accomplished or fulfilled or something that you can look at and say, okay, that's popular but done. It pertains to the past. They're looking to the future, saying this is something that's going to come up in the future. The most interesting quote I came across was from the Chicago Tribune in 1872. And this is a quote, "If our manifest destiny," again, in parentheses, "is ever fulfilled, we must welcome a Cuban, a Canadian, and a Mexican, and can claim that we have a government the world hath never seen and will never see again." So again, this idea of manifest destiny seems to be a lot bigger than this idea of east to west expansion. The fact that they're mentioning a Cuban, a Canadian, and a Mexican seems to show that this idea is much broader than what we've talked about in the past. So this is what I started to do. This is where my research led me. This is what sort of led to the formation of a book that looks well past the 1840s into the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s. What I consider sort of a reconsideration of manifest destiny, a reinterpretation of manifest destiny, one that sees it not as successful and overtly popular, but one that was challenged and then eventually fell apart by the time we get to Grant's presidency. So that's the sort of the points I wanted to go ahead and put up on the board. I'll be talking about these through the rest of the lecture. And as we go along, I will give a pitch for the book. I have to do this briefly, so we have a lot of points to cover today, and there's a lot of sort of ground to cover. So again, the book in each individual chapter will look at the events that I'll talk about in today's talk. One of the things is that the book will give you many more details about this. If you disagree, or if you sort of don't see eye to eye with me on manifest destiny, I do think it's worthwhile to check out the book because you can see many more of the sources instead of a handful of quotes that I can throw in this PowerPoint, but that don't really give you sort of that broad overview. But to go back, one of the things I established in my book is that we need to rethink and reconceptualize manifest destiny itself. So I start off with a relatively simple definition. Manifest destiny was the belief the United States would eventually take over the contiguous portions of North America along with Cuba. So for the sake of the book, what I look at is Canada, all of Mexico, and Cuba, because those are the three regions that the US really seeks to acquire over the passage of time. Point two, support ebbed and flowed from 1845 to 1872, but only a small portion of Americans actively supported it or believed in it. Again, this is something that I think is really important to see, that over the course of time, there's sort of this back and forth between groups. I'll get to this more as we go. And let's see, there we go. The last point, ultimately unsuccessful and unfulfilled. I think one of the important things that I'll eventually hit on is that manifest destiny was not as popular as it's been made out to be, but that it's ultimately unsuccessful, and it's something that eventually sort of fades away as time passes. So I'll keep on going with this. One of the challenges with writing the book, and I think one of the challenges of giving this talk today, is the fact that this covers a lot of ground. One of the things that I had originally started out to do and that changed quickly over the course of time, I originally thought, okay, I look at the 1840s and maybe a little bit into the 1850s, but in several of the quotes that I showed you, I realized that people are debating manifest destiny far past that. So they're talking about it during the Civil War, they talk about it after the Civil War, they talk about it decades after the Civil War. So I really tried to write a comprehensive book that looks at manifest destiny from the 1840s. So when we see the term originate, all the way through into the middle of the 1870s, a decade that we sort of typically overlook, but I think is really important. I wanted to put the key events up on the slide for you all, just so you could get a sense of where this talk will be going. It is a lot of ground. I will move relatively quickly, so we sort of fly through the US-Mexican War. We'll get through filibustering a lot of events really quickly. I hope you all can sort of track, but if you have any questions at the end, I'm happy to answer any that you might have. So to go back just a little bit, the story starts in 1844 when James K. Polk wins the election over Henry Clay of Kentucky. Now, Polk is an expansionist. Clay is not an expansionist, or at least Clay is not interested in annexing Texas. When Polk wins the election, Tyler, who's the president at the time, will ram through the annexation of Texas relatively quickly. Texas will become a state. What you eventually see happen, just to kind of drop you in here and get you caught up, the US will enter a war with Mexico in 1846. So it's at that point in time that you'll see people start debating manifest destiny. As I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, the phrase manifest destiny first appears in 1845. It's really heavily debated by the time you hit 1846, 47, and 48. And that's when you really start to see sort of these debates play out. Now, during the US-Mexican War, the question becomes, what should the United States do with Mexico? Again, thinking at this time of Mexico not as current boundaries, but as a land stretching basically, if you think of today's Southwest, all of that, that becomes a debate within the United States. Proponents of Manifest Destiny, who I'll talk about in just a bit, members of the All Mexico movement, will argue that the United States needs to take all of Mexico. So literally all of it. That's the core of their idea. Now, the flip side of this is the Whig Party. So led by Henry Clay, but still pretty prominent in the United States. They traditionally pull just under half of sort of the votes in each presidential election. They're not super successful at winning presidential elections, but they're still there. They will put forth what's known as an anti-territory amendment. So an individual by the name of John M. Berrien will introduce an amendment into the Senate. This is, quote, "It is hereby declared to be the true intent and meaning of Congress that the war with Mexico ought not to be prosecuted by this government with any view to the dismemberment of that republic." The Whigs argue that you can go to war with Mexico, but that it's not necessary to claim Mexican land at the end of that conflict. Henry Clay delivers one of the more famous anti-war speeches in Lexington in 1847. Clay says, quote, "It seems to me that it is the duty of our country, as well on the score of moderation as with the view of avoiding discord and discontent at home, to abstain from seeking to conquer and annex the United States, Mexico, or any part of it, and especially to disabuse the public mind in any quarter of the Union of the impression that a desire for conquest is cherished for the purpose of propagating or expanding slavery." So as a slave owner, Henry Clay essentially says in the speech, look, we can't take land from Mexico, it's immoral, but also we're going to fight over this if we take land from Mexico. So this becomes sort of the anti-Manifest Destiny argument that emerges over time. No. There we go. What you eventually see is this, and this is essentially the Whigs' critique. I use it as a cover for the book because I do think it illustrates sort of the major point of the book. Whigs argue, and this is from a humorous writer who writes a series of stories over the 1840s by the name of Seba Smith. This is the idea that if the United States, as you can sort of see in this image, takes on the massive mission of Manifest Destiny. So as you can see in the sails, it says annexation over North America. The US is moving towards South America. I think it's very interesting. You see Cuba sort of out there in the water with the US sort of menacing there. This idea of the United States eventually takes those territories, what will eventually happen is the United States will break apart. There will be too many factions within the US. There will be trouble, as Henry Clay says, this idea, if we take land from Mexico, we're going to fight over, which looking back, he's right. I mean, the US does. On the flip side is this, and this has become sort of the opposite edge of the argument. These are Manifest Destiny's proponents who throughout the US-Mexican War argue the US should take all of Mexico. The quote from the Democratic Review, which will pop up a lot in today's talk, quote, "Until every acre of the North American continent is occupied by citizens of the United States, the foundation of the future empire will not have been laid." And this is from the Democratic Review of October 1847. Again, this idea of Manifest Destiny, that it's the destiny of the US to take these territories. The New York Herald says something remarkably similar. It is the manifest destiny of the Anglo-Saxon race to people the continent. The more attention we give to the annexation of all of Mexico, the more satisfied we are that the present prospect should not be allowed to escape. So you have these two sides sort of duking it out over the course of the US-Mexican War. You have one group, the proponents of Manifest Destiny, who are firmly committed to taking all of Mexico. You have the other group on the flip side, Henry Clay, most of the Whig Party, who say, if we take this land, we're going to have trouble. What ends up happening, as I think most of us realize from the current boundaries of the United States, is something of a tie in that Whigs concede that they can't block all territory from being acquired, or any territory from being acquired by the United States. Most Democrats will eventually sort of accede that they don't want to take all of Mexico. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which would be ratified in 1848, is essentially a compromise between Whigs and Democrats, which provides the US with its claim to what becomes the US Southwest. So again, Texas all the way up through California. So still a massive chunk of land, not what the proponents of Manifest Destiny want, however. And I think this is an important point that I try to make over and over in the book. Proponents of Manifest Destiny, most notably Stephen Douglas, who will sort of pop in our story a bit, vote against the treaty, believing it takes too little land. So again, there's a large contingent of Americans who believe that the United States would be better off if it kept carving up Mexico. And when it captured Mexico City, boom, if it just took all of that land and just sort of did away with Mexico as a country altogether. Now, 1848 is an interesting year because not only is there this debate over the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the US also enters a presidential election between Zachary Taylor, who is a Whig, and Lewis Cass, who is the Democrat. Now, 1848 is not what we'd consider to be a super popular presidential election. Most people, when you talk to them about Zachary Taylor, don't exactly perk up, and the same with Lewis Cass, who's sort of an unknown figure. Seen here in this cartoon as Taylor is sort of pummeling Cass, which I just enjoy because everyone's sort of just watching going, what is happening? So you see this play out in 1848. Now, one of the things about presidential elections in the 1840s, and I think this holds true throughout most of the 19th century, it's very partisan, it's very bitter. It's not exactly what we would consider to be a friendly election. There's a lot of names hurled at individuals. One of my favorite, and this is from Parson Brownlow, who runs a newspaper at this point in time in Tennessee, has his little slide where he continually forgets to put the C on Cass. So again, letting the readers sort of get into that particular joke. The partisanship is really high. So as historians, we can often look at this and go, okay, what you see in this election is two sides battling it out. They're name calling. They're basically going at each other that way, but it doesn't have a lot of meaning. What I argue in the book and in the position that I hold is that this election does have a lot of meaning, and you can see this. This is an image from 1848. This is a Democratic candidate, Lewis Cass, who's sitting on top, and the caption simply reads, President Cass beginning operations, losing no time. This idea that if you elect Cass as president, what you will see is the US will immediately enter a war. They will make that argument time and time again, which leads to one of my sort of favorite images. I'm not sure if you can sort of make out all of this. If you look at this particular image, this is Lewis Cass again, sort of from a picture of Lewis Cass, a war president. If you look at his sword, and I'm not sure if it's fitting perfectly in your all screen, on the sword itself is the words Manifest Destiny, and then territories that they allege that Cass will want to conquer. So New Mexico, California, Chihuahua, Mexico, Zacatecas, Mexico itself, sort of writ large, Peru, Yucatan, Cuba. There's this idea throughout 1848 that Cass is a menace, that if you elect Cass as president, he's going to try to fulfill Manifest Destiny. And I think the one thing I keep coming back to, and I highlight this quite a few times in the book, the picture of Manifest Destiny, as you can see here, is very negative. It's this idea if the US fulfills Manifest Destiny, it's going to lead the United States into a war. They pitch Zachary Taylor as the peace candidate. Zachary Taylor wins in 1848. So it does sort of change things at this point in time. When Taylor takes 1848, you do see sort of a dropping for a short period of time of the idea of Manifest Destiny, as you have an individual who's not super interested in it, which leads us to the next part, Cuban annexation. So the US has been debating whether or not to peel off more of Mexico. The next sort of target of US expansionists becomes Cuba, which becomes the region that so many individuals want to purchase, invade, somehow capture. So James K. Polk, before he leaves office, approaches Spain with an offer to buy Cuba. So while the US-Mexican war is ongoing, as that's sort of winding down, he has his ambassador go approach Spain. They make an offer. Spain just laughs. They're like, yeah, no, we're not selling this. They offer as much as 100 million, which is sort of a ridiculous sum in 1848. Spain's like, yeah, not going to happen. As I just talked about, Taylor wins the election. The Whigs are not interested in adding much territory to the United States. So there is really no interest in Cuba, which leads us to point 3. Some of the more interesting individuals I come across in the book are what are known as filibusters. Now, this has nothing to do with the filibusters that you see on television today when someone tries to filibuster a piece of legislation. A filibuster in the 1840s and 1850s refers to somebody who wants to use an armed force to invade a foreign country to overthrow their government. So as crazy as this might sound today, this happens quite a bit in the 1840s and 1850s. Filibusters will set out from the United States and invade Cuba. So I put two of their names up on the board. Narciso Lopez is a Spaniard who eventually moves to Cuba. He becomes sort of dissatisfied with the government. He then moves to New York, where he organizes a group of men who will invade Cuba on a couple of occasions. He's joined by a lot of Americans. One of the more famous is William Logan Crittenden, who, if you're here in Frankfurt, if you know the name John J. Crittenden, that's his nephew. So William Logan Crittenden joins up on this expedition. They're captured, they're executed. Things do not go well for the filibusters. But again, this idea of we need Cuba, there's a large portion of individuals who sort of try to get Cuba. I'd like to sort of show the other side of it, that there's a lot of Americans who either portray Lopez in a negative way, or who else argue that it's really not necessary for the United States to acquire Cuba, that that's just not something that the US needs to do. So here you have an image of Lopez, who is executed in 1851. This is a year before his execution by the Spanish officials, running away from Cuba. Now, the failure of filibusters to acquire Cuba or to break it off and sort of attach it to the US does not lead American presidents to abandon their dream of acquiring the island. Franklin Pierce, who is a Democrat, will win the election of 1852. Who again, Pierce is not sort of a famous president today. He's most known as being one of the lower ranked ones if you check sort of the presidential rankings of presidents and you look at that. When he wins the election in 1852, however, he does something different than his Whig predecessors. Pierce declares himself an expansionist, and he makes it evident that he wants Cuba. He declares in his inaugural address that he's not going to sort of be limited by his forebodings of what might happen if the US expands. So very much a shot at the Whigs. He argues that the United States should be able to expand and get Cuba. Now, one of the reasons why Pierce is not known as being an overtly successful president, instead of deciding on a policy and sort of coming out with a plan to acquire Cuba, he decides to ask his ministers in Europe to discuss a plan to acquire the island. So he's very interested in getting Cuba. He's not sure if he should allow filibusters to go out there and sort of start an insurrection that the US could then use to sort of foment a rebellion, or if his ministers can figure out a way to actually do this. So he asks them together, they meet in a couple of European cities. Eventually what comes out will be known as the Ostend Manifesto. Why this particular document is so intriguing is because it basically says, if Spain is unwilling to sell the United States Cuba, the United States has the right to invade and claim it as their own. Again, very militant language is used in this document. It becomes a very sort of bitter thing. When the delegation sort of ideas are put forth before the American public is not willing to go that far. In other words, it sort of explodes in Pierce's face. By 1855, as I write here, Pierce's plans to acquire Cuba are squashed. He has no chance. He's not able to sort of get that through. He leaves disappointed that his attempts to acquire Cuba are sort of not able to come to fruition. The Ostend Manifesto itself, which is the name that Whigs and later Republicans will sort of append to this document, all of them argue that the language used is sort of undiplomatic, but also that you couldn't use it in sort of regular language. This is one of my more enjoyable cartoons that I came across. This is James Buchanan, so the future president at this time. This is 1856, so slightly before the presidential election will be held. He helped write the manifesto. The language that is used is as if robbers come up to him and demand that he turns over his clothes because they need them. So it's basically inverting the language that's used to take, or that the US is using to justify the acquisition of Cuba by saying, look, if you did this to a normal person, if you walked up to a person and said, I really need your hat, you should have to give me your hat, and that sort of thing. Does not happen. Moving quickly. What you end up see happening is this. Pierce will step down from office. He will be replaced, or Buchanan will win the next presidential election. But what you start to see happen is what becomes a Republican critique of the idea of manifest destiny. So you'll start to see the formation of a new political party after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. What you increasingly see Republicans do is try to block all attempts to expand the United States. So essentially, James Buchanan wins, even though we might look at the 1850s and go, okay, they had to abandon their idea to acquire more land after all their plans to acquire Cuba sort of went downhill. No, James Buchanan throughout the 1850s continually tries to establish a protectorate over northern Mexico, so to try to sort of slough off a bigger chunk of Mexico, and also to purchase Cuba. Now, Republicans will block most of Buchanan's expansionist plans. They will argue that the slave power controls US foreign policy. And this is where you start to see sort of the changing of time lead to new arguments against manifest destiny. I have a couple of really good quotes for this one in particular, and you'll see this develop over the course of the 1850s. A senator by the name of John P. Hale, who's a Republican, goes, quote, although it was a mission of manifest destiny to take in the entire continent, he never seemed to remember that there was a north side to it. He was always traveling south. Again, this is sort of the back and forth that you'll start to see over the course of time. But what Republicans will increasingly argue and what they'll try to make people remember, manifest destiny is a continental idea. It's the idea that the United States will expand over the continent of North America. That means Canada. And one of the things that Republicans will constantly remind Southerners is if you really want to fulfill manifest destiny, you need to take in Canada. Up to this point in time, as I've talked about, the US has been trying to buy Cuba, more of northern Mexico, and has been trying to expand in what seems to be a southern direction. The critique is that this land is all going to be set up so that enslavers can take slaves down into these territories, or in the case of Cuba, to sort of add another slave state to the United States. Another congressman in this case gives a similar speech to John P. Hale, same year. We've heard much of manifest destiny. We're told that the people of the United States are destined to absorb and annex all of the continent of North America. But I'm sorry that all efforts have hitherto been made in but one direction. So again, the thing I always take from these quotes is that, firstly, manifest destiny is obviously not dead at this point in time. It's not something that just applies to the decade of the 1840s. This is something that's very much alive still in the late 1850s. Point B, people still see it as a conquest of the continent. John P. Hale, Foster, both of these gentlemen realize manifest destiny means more expansion. It means taking over more territory. So Buchanan gets blocked. He's not able to sort of pull off his expansionist schemes. All of this happens. Now we move into the American Civil War, which does not do away with the idea of manifest destiny, which is something that I find somewhat interesting. During the Civil War, a variety of viewpoints emerged on manifest destiny. And you'll see this play out. And this was, for me, the most difficult chapter to sort of come across and to write, simply because not many people have talked about manifest destiny in the Civil War. Most people see it as fading away by the 1840s, maybe early 1850s. What I found was Northerners and Southerners, sort of no matter their identification with what nation, they're still coming down on the side of manifest destiny means continental expansion. They still sort of talk about it. They still come down pretty fervently that Northerners do split. So one of the things I quickly came across was the fact that some Northerners see manifest destiny as sort of something that's morally wrong. There is a large contingent of former Whigs who move into the Republican Party who are like, look, guys, we told you if you take part of Mexico, you're going to fight over it. And we knew this was going to happen. And now you are fighting over it. And now we have a civil war. So there is a large group of that who sort of see that as a cause of the Civil War. Many Northerners also see this as a way to prepare for manifest destiny. And I'll get to this in a little when I talk about William Henry Seward and the eventual sort of embrace of expansion after the Civil War, is that many individuals still see this as sort of a viable idea. The flip side, and one of the things I found really interesting in doing this research, many Southerners sort of gloat that they have blocked manifest destiny by forming the Confederacy, which becomes something that I had not thought of before. The Charleston Mercury has a great quote, the Yankees. So again, making this manifest destiny sort of a Northern idea all of a sudden, the Yankees, who look upon the whole continent of North America as theirs, by manifest destiny are very much exercised with the impeachment of their pretensions. Every wooden nutmeg maker in the north boils with wrath as he sees Mexico passing away from his rapacity. Like, you kind of get this drawn out over the course of time, but there's many Southerners who look at manifest destiny as dead, but they look at manifest destiny as dead because they blame it on the Yankees. And this is a Yankee idea. Yankees want to take over North America. This is not something that they're interested in. For many, and especially for those writing in the newspapers, you'll see this play out time and time again. Now, this is sort of the reverse of what you see in the North. Many Northerners embrace the opposite idea, which is we have an army now. We have a really sort of well-equipped army, or at least that's how many journalists will see it. The New York Herald will go, Cuba and Canada must be conquered at one blow. All the West Indian islands must be conquered. It is necessary to send forth the armies conquering the conquer till this vast continent is ours. You sort of see this back and forth over time. You see Southerners who are sort of like, yeah, that's an idea in the past that we don't necessarily adhere to anymore. You see Northerners who are like, hey, this is kind of our chance. This is a chance to peel off a larger territory. This is what we should do. So you see this play out. Now, at the conclusion of the Civil War, you'll start to slowly see individuals return to the idea of manifest destiny. So again, it's somewhat backtracked during the Civil War itself, but the end of the Civil War will lead to a resurgence of manifest destiny. You'll see this sort of play out over time. The difference in post-Civil War expansionism, and it's different from sort of the pre-Civil War expansion, most of it's led at first by this guy, William Henry Seward, who becomes the Secretary of State. He's a firm Republican, sort of Lincoln, or one of those who is passed over for Lincoln in 1860, but he still eventually becomes Secretary of State. He'll stay on the administration when Andrew Johnson takes over upon Lincoln's assassination. Seward is very interested in expanding the United States, and he kind of comes from this from the perspective of the US now has solved, if you will, the issue of slavery. The passage of the 13th Amendment has sort of shattered that. What we can do now is expand the US as a free soil empire. So that's what you'll start to see Seward do. And Seward is most famous today for his treaty to buy Alaska, which is ratified in 1867. It happens relatively quickly. In 1867, Russia actually approaches the US. The US will eventually sort of ram that treaty through the Senate within the passage of a couple of weeks. The US will acquire Alaska. Now, why this is so important is because many proponents of annexing or buying Alaska from Russia become caught up in this idea that this is the next step on the path of manifest destiny, that the United States will sort of be able to overspread and overtake the continent based upon surrounding Canada by having Alaska. So it becomes sort of an interesting argument after the Civil War. Seward is not done. So what Seward will try to do next is to use his Alaska purchase. He eventually tries to purchase what is known as the Danish West Indies at the time. We today call them the US Virgin Islands. The US will not purchase them until 1917. So you get an idea sort of how all of this plays out. But Seward's attempt to eventually purchase and acquire more land is eventually blocked. And that's what I want to deal with today. One of the interesting things that you'll come across in newspapers, this is the New York Herald of 1867. You can sort of see how difficult it is to glean information. I know for the guys in CWGK and others, we look at a lot of newspapers. If we see a lot of newspapers, this is sort of the fine print we're dealing with. On this particular day in 1867, the New York Herald decided to do something really interesting. They decided to troll, if you will, William Henry Seward. So if you look closely, and I'll put these up on the screen for you, they'll eventually run a series of fictional ads. And this is one of them. It goes, cash, 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 cash paid for cast-off territory, best price given for old colonies north or south. Any impoverished monarchs retiring from the colonization business may find a good purchaser by addressing WHS, so William Henry Seward, Post Office, Washington, D.C. All communications strictly confidential. And they just run a series of these. Sell your property and save taxes. William H. Seward, dealer in real estate, Washington, D.C. If you look at each of these ads, though, these fictional ads which they run, the same critique applies to each one. It's basically, William Henry Seward is buying land that nobody wants. Here he is buying Alaska. Again, we know it's valuable. That sort of valuable nature will be revealed over time. Seward is just ridiculed for buying icebergs and for all the different things that sort of go along with it. When he tries to buy the Danish West Indies, that critique takes to an all new level, this idea that Seward is just buying up what people don't want. Here's an image you can see here where a Russian stranger, I say, little boy, do you want to trade? I've got a fine lot of bears, seals, icebergs. They're no use to me. I'll swap them for the other boats you've got. This idea of Alaska as being a wasteland, you'll see that sort of play out with William Henry Seward. The other one that I like to show is always William the Glutton, which is sort of poor old William Henry Seward here as he's bought the Russian purchase. He's looking at the Danish West Indies. How this all plays out is eventually he does get a treaty to acquire what becomes the US Virgin Islands. The US Senate refuses to vote on it. So they basically table it. There's so much ridicule, they decide it's not popular enough to get through. So Seward will leave office having sort of his unaccomplished empire on the table. He wants more land, he's unable to get it. And you sort of see that play out. But the story doesn't end there. So it's moving through this somewhat rapidly here as we sort of approach the conclusion. US Grant is also an expansionist. So most of the presidents I've dealt with in today's talk, they're expansionists. US Grant, who comes into office after Andrew Johnson, also an expansionist. Now, Grant will win the election of 1868. He is a Republican, so he's somewhat different than most of the other individuals we've talked about, in that most of them were Democratic expansionists. Grant is a Republican expansionist. He actually gets a treaty through that would have provided the United States with the Dominican Republic. So at the time, most referred to as Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, that would have become a part of the United States. So he approaches the Senate, he has a treaty in hand, and he puts it before the Senate. If they get a 2/3 majority, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic would have become part of the United States. What's kind of intriguing about this is this one also crumbles. The United States is also unable to get this through the Senate. And you can sort of see it in the image here. One of the things that will eventually torpedo a lot of these attempts at annexation and expansion is race. One of the main objections to acquiring Alaska was sort of the derogatory references to Alaska natives and this idea that if the US annexes Alaska, these would potentially be senators who would be sent from Alaska to join the United States. You see that in the image here, where you have Seward and Johnson welcoming the new senators, obviously a spoof on Alaska natives and sort of what they bring to the table. The same thing happens to US Grant when he tries to annex the Dominican Republic. You'll see a very explicit sort of racial critique of manifest destiny, this idea that the United States should not be acquiring land or territory with the predominance of individuals who are not white. It's most clear in this image. And this is one of my favorite images from the era. If you look closely on the left-hand side, you'll see an individual who is being pulled into the United States. And it's Uncle Sam saying, come on in. This is supposed to represent an individual or a Dominican. On the right is a well-dressed, depicted as white Cuban woman. You can sort of see manifest destiny there depicted on the side. And the idea is the US should not be annexing the Dominican Republic, i.e. where people are Black. The US should be annexing Cuba, where people are white. And that becomes one of the major critiques that you'll see of Grant and his attempt to pull in the Dominican Republic. It does not get through. The US obviously abandons that idea eventually, which leads us to what I call the death of manifest destiny. The New York Herald in 1872 will say, we want no more annexations. Our country is large enough. And that's generally the idea you see after the Grant administration. Although most presidents have made attempts to secure more territory for the United States and have attempted to gobble up all of Mexico, at one time, all of Canada, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, as well as the Virgin Islands, most of those attempts fail. And most people by the 1870s, or at least the predominant people who are speaking, argue that it's sort of done. We don't need more territory annexations. It's not necessary. Which leads me to another point. So as I kind of conclude and I bring this to a close, manifest destiny is typically seen as very popular. And one of the things that sort of separates my books from previous books on the topic is that I argue it's not really popular, that we've ignored most of the territories that the United States is not able to annex. But that sort of leads to a bigger historiographical question. Why do so many people see expansion, see manifest destiny as being popular and as being sort of the thing to do in the 1840s? And I like to use this particular image. I think if you look up manifest destiny, if you just go into Google and Google it, you're going to see this particular image pop up. Since the 1990s, this has been used, and I'm not joking, on seemingly every cover on books written about manifest destiny. I joked with Nebraska when they asked me what I wanted the cover to look like. I told them, you can do pretty much whatever you want, but please don't put that image on the front, because I want to have it sort of separated and a little bit different. But I do think the image illustrates one of my major points, which is that by the 1920s and 1930s, really entrenched in the historiography by the 1940s, people sort of forget about all the stuff I talked about today. So attempts to acquire all of Mexico, Cuba, Canada as being sort of the core of the idea of manifest destiny. Over time, manifest destiny for most historians, for most scholars by the 1940s, becomes east to west expansion. And again, they'll eventually tack on this image and use it to sort of illustrate manifest destiny, the angel of progress moving east to west, this idea that it's popular, it's pervasive, but it's kind of small. It's that the US just wants the West Coast. That's what's really popular in the 1840s. That's manifest destiny at its core. But I question that. And that's one of the things I draw out in my epilogue, the use of this particular image to illustrate manifest destiny. And this is why. Gas image American Progress is first used here. So if you look at the image on the left, it's run in a magazine called Prophet's Western World in 1873. So essentially what they have is this image. It then has an accompanying picture. It's painted by a painter by the name of John Gast. Again, it's called American Progress. What I began to look at is, okay, why is this so identified with manifest destiny? What's sort of the reason for that? But also, what is the purpose of this image? The thing that pops up and that the words that accompany this particular image is, quote, this beautiful picture is purely national in design and represents the United States portion of the American continent in all its beauty and variety from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The phrase itself was really telling. And as soon as I came across that, I had one of those sort of aha moments. No believer in manifest destiny would have used the phrase the United States portion of the American continent, particularly not in 1873. That simply would not have been done. To give you a couple of examples from this, again, to go back to an example I used at the beginning of the talk, quote, if our manifest destiny is ever fulfilled, we must welcome a Canadian, a Cuban, and a Mexican. Clearly in 1872, they don't see it as being done. There's other quotes that illustrate the same thing. Manifest destiny is continentalism. It's this idea of the United States expanding over the entire continent. And again, you can go through newspapers.com, you can go through a ton of sources, you can find these quotes. This is how people see manifest destiny in the 1870s. So essentially what happens is after individuals see manifest destiny or sort of redefine it as Eastern to Western expansion, they'll append Gast's image and say, okay, this is manifest destiny. What I argue and what I try to really dig into in the book itself is that's really not the case. Manifest destiny for anyone living in the 19th century is continentalism. It includes Cuba, and it's much bigger than Gast's image was sort of meant to be, which I can then sort of get to why this all matters. There's a couple of reasons why I think we need to reconfigure our ideas of manifest destiny. And one of them is this. The myth of manifest destiny, so this idea of manifest destiny as east to west, sort of the image of Gast that's used on most covers of books, obscures US foreign policy failures and reifies ideas of American exceptionalism. And that's something I keep coming back to. When we're taught US history, or when most of us learn US history, we don't learn about the failed attempts at expanding the US, especially in the 19th century. We're typically sort of told the story of Texas, Southwest, Cuba maybe pops in, but it's usually in the 1890s when the US gets into the Spanish-American War. that's typically, it doesn't really typically sort of, it's not included in the 1850s. So I think a lot of times we can sort of take these ideas of American exceptionalism and pull them back by saying, oh yeah, what Americans thought the country would look like is what it eventually became. When if you actually look at the 19th century, that never happened. The idea of manifest destiny that's put forth is continentalism. So it doesn't sort of highlight that. The second thing, and the second point I try to make throughout the book, is the myth of manifest destiny makes us forget that Americans vigorously disagreed about what role the US should play in the world, which is something that I think is really important. People talked about this. I think we can sort of look at US expansion as being predestined, as the US as sort of filling out the borders of what becomes the United States, in the sense of the borders we're familiar with, when in actuality, people disagreed. People disagreed if the US should get Cuba. They disagreed if the US should add the Dominican Republic, if Canada was beneficial, if more of Mexico was beneficial, heck, if Texas, New Mexico, and California were beneficial. People debated that. There were votes, not on that particular issue, but on treaties that do pop up. The last thing I do want to sort of emphasize, I think the myth of manifest destiny simplifies the past. It makes us think that everyone agrees and that sort of this is the way it played out because it had to play out this way. And I think that's one of the struggles for all historians, is a lot of times when we're telling the story, it's just more complicated. There's a lot of reasons why the US took the territory that it took. There's a lot of debates. There's a lot of sort of back and forth. And what I really try to do throughout the book is to highlight the fact that people don't agree, there's disagreement, all of that. So I know I went a little bit past, I think, but I will put this up. Any questions I'm happy to answer at this point in time. I did want to quickly put up, Nebraska has a discount. So if you go there, I might not should point this out. Amazon is also doing a sale on it. So if you go on Amazon, it's also doing a sale. So it's a little cheaper. It might help.
Thank you, Daniel. That was awesome. Thank you. That just, I love how much you're complicating this story. Yeah, it just got a lot more interesting. So we will take questions now. Let's see, I believe we actually already have one in the chat. So I will go ahead and start with that one. Laura says, I have a question for after the program. Did the people who supported Manifest Destiny sway to change their ideas after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Gadsden Purchase? With the US granting citizenship to Mexicans and by proxy whiteness, did this give some of them pause in arguing for Manifest Destiny?
It's a really good question. One of the things that's really interesting is individuals after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So Stephen Douglas is the person I'm thinking about the most. The Democratic Review also sort of plays this out throughout the entire decade of 1850s. They're just bitter at how it played out. And honestly, the weird thing about it, they don't see it in the same way. They think the US can continue to what they call Texanize. So send down individuals into northern Mexico, break off chunk by chunk until those eventually become states within the United States. So they're not really troubled by race. And I say that not to say they're not racist. Stephen Douglas is essentially calling for the extermination of Mexico, and he really doesn't care if that means wiping out Mexicans as a whole. So again, the proponents of Manifest Destiny, they don't always specify what they mean. They're just bitter because they see the US as sort of an ever-expanding empire. So as strange as it might sound, they don't abandon it after 1848. What I argue, and what I really try to draw out in my chapter on the US-Mexican War, moderate Democrats do. So there's a big portion of moderate Democrats within the Democratic Party who, after the US-Mexican War, start to argue, we don't need to take any more of that territory. They're afraid of racial mixing. There's a lot of sort of just racial slurs hurled about. But the idea becomes, look, this is actually a good border, because if we have sort of this line, we can exclude Mexicans from citizenship. This will work out. We don't want more territory. What's weird is that the proponents of Manifest Destiny, O'Sullivan, Douglas, you see this with Seward as well, even after the war. They sort of have this idea of the US ever expanding. They don't abandon that. To them, again, I'm not sure all the nuances, for Grant, especially with how would that work if you annex the Dominican Republic? Do those individuals get full citizenship right away? How is that going to work during Reconstruction? He doesn't really delve into that too much. It's just like, we can do it. It's the same with Mexico. Stephen Douglas just thinks we can peel off more and more of it. Yeah, and just take more and more of it, and that's just going to work out. Stephen Douglas, he kind of drives you crazy the more you read. Like his speeches, you just want to tell him, like, dude, come on. Like you're so confused.
So I'm sure there are some more questions. I think somebody else, oh, Laura says thank you in the chat. We are a small enough group today. If anybody wants to just unmute and ask a question, please feel free to do so.
I had a follow-up to your last comment, Daniel. I think you sort of hinted at this, but if you could expand on it, if you can. But this thought that there may have been sort of explicit ideas about genocide of whether it's in Mexico or newly conquered territories. Was that something that was explicitly talked about, of like ethnic cleansing of? Obviously, the term is not is anachronistic, but.
Well, that's kind of the tricky thing, because the one thing I hope this sort of brings back is Canada's always a part of this, in the sense of they always see Canada. Now, again, they treat Canada very differently. So I do want to point that out. The idea of Canada is, well, one day Canada is just going to join the United States. So Manifest Destiny itself is always sort of nuanced that way, with Canadians, again, largely because they're seen as white, will eventually sort of become just convinced that they're better off in the Union, in the United States. With Mexico, it becomes a lot trickier. Again, a lot of times Cuba and Cubans will be sort of seen, as you saw in that one image, as white. So this idea that if they become part of the United States, again, you have language barriers, you have religious barriers. There's a lot of people who don't want sort of Catholicism, who don't want sort of that. So when it comes to Cuba, when it comes to Canada, there's not really that explicit talk of genocide. And again, they won't call it genocide throughout most of the documents. With Mexico, that's sort of an underlying sort of notion with expansion in a southerly direction. The US can either just move in there, or a lot of the ideas Buchanan Bandy's this idea about throughout the 1850s, established, again, a law and order protectorate, for lack of a better term, where they can really just expand the US. And again, this is very what happens in the 1890s with the Philippines. This idea of the US can tutor people until they're ready for citizenship. How that would work out, again, we know from the 1890s, not well. But I think that's kind of the idea. Douglas will take a lot of the ideas that apply to Native Americans. So this idea of them just sort of fading away and going away and sort of generally just moving, they'll apply those same things to Mexicans and say, well, essentially the Mexican race will fade away over time and we'll just expand. How that's supposed to happen, the details aren't there. Again, they won't use the term genocide, but yeah, they want to blot Mexico off the map. Their view of Canada is a lot different. Again, why Stephen Douglas is a little bit crazy.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? And either in
Julie is actually with us.
Sorry, that's a radio. Okay. Either in the chat, or please feel free to jump in if you'd like to unmute.
So not really a question. I know that's a most obnoxious thing for somebody to hear. Hey, buddy. I think you actually, because I deal with the Spanish-American War, this actually does make a lot of sense to the kind of unbalanced way that the United States seems to be looking at the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, what its aims are, and how some people seem to be thinking that it's about expansion and other people think it's about economics, and some people want nothing to do with it whatsoever. It makes a lot of sense within that larger context of that's always been the problem with Manifest Destiny, is that it was never as simple as what we were, throwing on a slide for our survey courses. And so I think that that could be a potential thing to kind of think about, like, as an educator, is like larger scheme of it, is that manifest destiny changes like what it means to different people, but no one agrees on it like whatsoever. Anyway,
Yeah.
I just thought that I had while I was listening.
No, and the one thing I would like to do, and it's good to see you, is that I'd like to tie in the book ends in 1870. As you can tell from today's talk, like the biggest challenge of this is to really take something from the 1840s through the 1870s, because you're not dealing with just one decade. I mean, we're dealing with a lot of time, and there's a lot of nuance between Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan. What's happening after the Civil War, where you're dealing with Reconstruction? That's a lot different than pre-Civil War, where they're looking at Cuba as slave territory, essentially, and post-Civil War, where they're like, oh, but these people are fighting for freedom. They can join in with us and we can be an anti-slavery empire. So I think it does shift over time. I do think it sort of ties in the difference, I would say, between mid-19th century and late 19th century. There's just so much more talk of taking actual territory and incorporating it into the US. I mean, Grant wants the Dominican Republic to be a part of the US as a state. By the 1890s, it's like, Puerto Rico, really, do you like how? I think those debates just become a little bit different over time. But yeah, I see a lot of overlap. I would argue that like you could take the 1830s to the 1920s, and there's a lot of overlap between what the US hopes to do and sort of the ideas of expansion. Maybe one day I can get that far.
We can collab on it.
I know it's yeah.
Well, I look forward to that. You can both come
One day.
and present on your collaboration when that happens. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more comments or questions unless somebody wants to jump in real quick here. So with that, we will go ahead and end the program. Thank you guys so much for coming and hanging out today. We've very much enjoyed hearing from Daniel. Go buy the book. Gave you a discount code. Please, again, join us next month for Dr. William H. Turner and the Harlan Renaissance. All right, y'all have a great afternoon. Thanks. Daniel, thank you.
Thank you for having me.